The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the Galactic Defense Academy. Katie Barnes stood in line with 30 other recruits, her hands clasped behind her back in perfect military posture. At 5 feet and 2 inches tall, she looked like a child next to the massive alien warriors surrounding her. To her left stood Zixathera, a Krillian whose black exoskeleton gleamed like polished armor. The insect-like creature towered 8 feet above the ground, her 4 arms ending in razor-sharp claws that could slice through steel. Her compound eyes reflected the morning light as she looked down at Katie, with what might have been amusement. On Katie's right, Melindra swayed gently in the breeze. The Valonian's crystalline skin caught and refracted the sunlight into rainbow patterns across her tall, graceful form. Energy crackled between her fingers as she practiced small light displays, showing off the natural power that made her species famous across the galaxy. Behind them, Gorth the Bracken shifted his weight, from foot to foot. The bear-like alien stood nearly 9 feet tall, covered in thick brown fur that could stop most projectile weapons. His people were known for their incredible strength and endurance in battle. Katie kept her eyes forward, ignoring the whispers and clicks that passed between the alien recruits. She had heard it all before during the 3 weeks since arriving. At the academy, the other species found it hard to believe that humans had been accepted into the Galactic Defense Force at all. Commander Thexval emerged from the training facility, his heavy footsteps echoing across the courtyard. The massive Krillian wore the scars of 100 battles across his carapace, and his left antenna had been severed in combat years ago. He was one of the most decorated warriors in the galaxy, and his reputation for turning soft recruits into hardened soldiers was legendary. "Listen up, worms," the commander's voice boomed across the training ground. His translator device rendered his clicking speech into perfect standard galactic, but the menace in his tone needed no translation. "Today we begin advanced combat simulation training. Some of you think you are warriors because you come from warrior species. You are wrong. You are nothing but larvae until you prove otherwise." His compound eyes swept across the formation, lingering for a moment on Katie. "The simulation will test everything you think you know about survival, tactics, and combat. Most of you will fail. Some of you will fail so badly that we will recommend you return to your homeworlds and find safer occupations." Zixthera's mandibles clicked, and what Katie had learned was the Krillian equivalent of laughter. "Commander, what about the human? My people have studied Earth's military history. Humans have never faced anything like the challenges we train for here. Perhaps she should observe from the safety of the command center." Several other recruits joined in with their own versions of laughter. The Valuians created musical tones that sounded like bells, while the Brackens made low rumbling sounds deep in their chests. Commander Thexval raised one clawed hand for silence. "The human stays in the simulation with the rest of you. Command has decided that all species in the Galactic Defense Force must train together, regardless of their limitations." Katie felt her jaw tighten but kept her expression neutral. She had expected this. Earth was the newest member of the Galactics. Federation and humans were still seen as the weak link in every chain. Most alien species viewed Earth as a pleasant but unremarkable world populated by creatures barely above the level of clever animals. "The simulation will take place on Cathara 7, the commander continued. "A death world where the survival rate for trained warriors is 12%. For most species, that number drops to 3% for first-time trainees." Melindra's crystalline features shifted in what Katie recognized as concern. The Valonians were not known for physical courage, preferring to use their energy manipulation abilities from a safe distance. "Commander, what is the survival rate for humans in this simulation?" The commander's scarred head turned toward Katie, and she could see her own reflection multiplied dozens of times in his compound eyes. "Humans have never successfully completed the Cathara 7 simulation. The survival rate for their species is 0%. The courtyard fell silent except for the distant sounds of other training units practicing their drills. Katie could feel the weight of 30 pairs of alien eyes studying her, waiting for her reaction. Some expected her to ask to be excused from the exercise. Others probably hoped she would break down or show fear. Instead, Katie took one small step forward. Permission to speak, Commander? Granted. Will we be using standard equipment loadouts for the simulation, or equipment modified for each species? Commander. Thexval's antennae twitched, which Katie had learned indicated surprise. Standard loadouts. Each recruit receives the same gear regardless of species. Why do you ask? Just wanted to confirm the parameters, sir. When do we begin? The commander stared at her for a long moment. Behind her, she could hear Gorth whispering to another Bracken recruit about the strange human who seemed eager to enter a simulation designed to kill her. We begin in 1 hour, the commander announced. Use the time to check your equipment and make peace with whatever gods your species worship. For some of you, this will be the last time you see the sun. As the formation dispersed, Katie headed toward the equipment bay. She could feel the other recruits watching her, their alien features twisted with confusion and amusement. A few made comments loud enough for her to hear. The human thinks this is some kind of game, Zixthera clicked to her fellow Krillians. On Earth, humans are prey animals, Melindra chimed to her Valonian friends. They have no natural weapons, no armor, no special abilities. How did such a weak species ever develop space travel? Katie ignored the comments as she reached the equipment bay. The quartermaster, an elderly Bracken with gray fur, looked her up and down with obvious skepticism. You sure you want to go through with this, little one? No shame in waiting for an easier simulation. Katie met his gaze steadily. I'm sure. The quartermaster shrugged and handed her the standard loadout. Plasma rifle, scanner, medical kit, survival gear, and rations for 3 days. The rifle had been modified with a smaller grip to accommodate human hands, but otherwise it was identical to what the other recruits would carry. As Katie checked her equipment, she noticed Zixthara and 2 other Krillians watching her from across the bay. Their conversation was too quiet for the translator to pick up, but she could guess the content from their gestures and the way they kept looking at her. 20 minutes later, all 30 recruits stood at the entrance to the simulation chamber. The massive room could recreate any environment in the galaxy with perfect accuracy, down to the chemical composition of the air and the gravitational field strength. Commander Thexval stood before the sealed door, his scarred carapace reflecting the harsh lighting. Inside this chamber, you will face the worst that the galaxy has to offer. Some of you will discover courage you never knew you had. Others will learn that they are not meant for military service. His gaze found Katie in the crowd. And some of you will learn why your species has never survived this simulation. The massive door began to slide open, revealing only darkness beyond. Strange sounds echoed from within, the rustle of alien vegetation, the distant calls of unknown creatures, and something else that made even the battle-hardened alien recruits shift nervously. Remember, the commander called out as the recruits began filing into the chamber. In there you are not Krillians or Valonians or Brackens. You are prey. And everything else is hunting you. Katie Barnes stepped into the darkness, her human eyes already beginning to adapt to the dim light filtering through the alien canopy above. Behind her, she could hear the nervous chatter of her fellow recruits as they entered what might be their final test. She smiled slightly as she checked her rifle one last time. They had no idea what they were dealing with. The simulation chamber transformed around them with startling speed. The sterile walls and bright lights vanished, replaced by the twisted landscape of Cathara 7. Katie found herself standing in a forest that looked like something from a nightmare. Black trees stretched upward into darkness, their bark rough and covered with sharp spikes. Red and orange fungi glowed dimly between the twisted trunks, casting eerie shadows that moved with the alien breeze. The air smelled wrong. It carried the scent of decay and something else that made Katie's nose wrinkle. Her scanner beeped softly, showing atmospheric readings that would be poisonous to most Earth life. The gravity felt heavier than normal, making each step require more effort. Around her, the other recruits were adjusting to the environment. Zixthara tested the air with her antennae, her compound eyes reflecting the fungal glow. Melindra created small balls of light between her fingers, adding to the dim illumination. Gorth sniffed loudly, his bear-like features wrinkling in disgust. at the alien sense. Commander Thexval's voice echoed from speakers hidden throughout the simulation. Welcome to Cathara 7, the Tomb World. Your mission is simple, but not easy. A survey ship crashed here 6 months ago. The crew is dead, but the ship's data core contains vital intelligence about enemy fleet movements. You must retrieve that data core and return to the extraction point. Katie looked at her scanner. A blinking dot showed their current position, while another dot marked the extraction point roughly 2 kilometers away. No sign of the crashed ship yet. You have 6 hours to complete this mission, the commander continued. After 6 hours, the simulation will release its apex predator. Nothing that has encountered this creature has survived. Do not be in the simulation when that happens. Several recruits exchanged nervous glances. Katie noticed that even the confident Krillian seemed worried about facing something called an apex predator. Teams of 4, Zixthera announced, taking charge as she always did. I will lead one team. She pointed her clawed finger at Melindra and Gorth. You two, with me. Then, her compound eyes fixed on Katie. And I suppose we take the human. Someone needs to carry extra supplies. Katie said nothing, but she adjusted her equipment pack and checked her rifle. The other teams were forming around them, each led by one of the larger alien species. None of them wanted Katie on their team, so she ended up with Zixthera by default. Try to keep up, little human, Melindra said as she created a small light orb to hover above her crystalline hand. This world will eat you alive if you fall behind. The team began moving through the twisted forest. Zixthera took point, her natural armor allowing her to push through the thorny undergrowth. Gorth followed behind her, using his massive strength to bend branches out of the way. Melindra stayed in the middle, her energy barriers protecting her from the sharp thorns and acid-dripping leaves. Katie brought up the rear, moving more carefully than the others. While they relied on their natural armor and strength, she had to think about each step. The ground was uneven and covered with roots that could trip an unwary traveler. Some of the plants had leaves that reached out when creatures passed nearby, trying to snag clothing or skin. How did your species ever survive long enough to develop technology? Zixthera called back over her shoulder. You have no armor, no natural weapons, no special abilities. What kept the predators from eating you all? Katie ducked under a low branch covered in poisonous-looking berries. We learned to think our way out of problems instead of fighting our way out. Gorth laughed, a rumbling sound deep in his chest. Thinking does not stop claws or fangs. Strength stops them. Power stops them. Different approaches work for different species, Katie replied calmly. They had been walking for nearly an hour when Katie noticed something wrong. She stopped and held up her hand, causing the others to halt as well. What is it now? Zixthera demanded. We do not have time for human weakness. Katie ignored the insult and pointed to the ground ahead of Gorth. Do not step there. The massive bracken looked down at what appeared to be solid ground covered with the same fungal growth as the rest of the forest floor. It looks fine to me. Look at the pattern, Katie said quietly. See how the fungi form a perfect circle? And notice how there are no animal tracks crossing that area? The local wildlife knows to avoid it. Melindra created a brighter light and held it closer to the suspicious ground. Now they could all see what Katie had noticed. The fungi were indeed arranged in a perfect circle, and the ground within that circle looked slightly different from the surrounding area. Zixthera picked up a rock and threw it onto the suspicious ground. The rock disappeared through what had looked like solid earth, falling into a deep pit below. They could hear it bouncing off the walls for several seconds before the sound faded. Trap, Gorth said, stating the obvious. How did you see that? Melindra asked Katie, her crystalline features showing genuine curiosity. My people learn to notice things that do not belong, Katie replied. We had to, or we died. They found a way around the pit trap and continued deeper into the forest. The trees grew larger and more twisted as they went, and the fungal growth became thicker. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness above them. Something large was moving through the treetops, but the canopy was too thick to see what it was. Katie's scanner showed they were getting closer to the crashed ship. The signal was still faint, but it was definitely ahead of them. She also noticed that her scanner was picking up other movement signatures scattered throughout the forest. Most were small, probably local wildlife, but a few were much larger. "We are being watched," she said quietly. The others stopped and looked around. Zixthera extended her antennae, trying to detect any threats. Melindra increased the power of her light orb, pushing back the shadows. Gorth sniffed the air and growled low in his throat. "I smell something," the bracken said. "Something that has been following us." As if summoned by his words, a howl echoed through the forest. It was not like any sound Katie had ever heard before. It started low and deep, then rose to a shriek that seemed to drill into her skull. The sound was answered by others from different directions. "Pack hunters," Katie said. "How do you know?" Zixthera demanded. "They are communicating, coordinating their positions around us." More howls echoed through the forest, coming from all sides now. Whatever was out there, there were at least 6 of them, and they had surrounded the team. "Combat formation," Zixthera ordered. The 4 recruits moved back to back, weapons ready. The first attack came from above. Something dropped from the trees, landing in front of Gorth with a wet thud. In the dim light, Katie could see it was roughly the size of a large dog, but built like a spider. It had 8 legs ending in sharp claws, and a mouth full of needle teeth that dripped with something that glowed green in the darkness. Gorth swung his warhammer, smashing the creature against a tree trunk. Green blood splattered across the fungal growth, which immediately began to smoke and dissolve. "Acid blood," Melindra warned. "Do not let it touch you." More creatures dropped from the trees. They moved fast, scuttling across the ground on their 8 legs. Their glowing saliva left trails of dissolved vegetation wherever it touched. Zixthera opened fire with her plasma rifle, the bright bolts, lighting up the forest. One creature exploded in a shower of acid blood that ate through the bark of nearby trees. Melindra created energy barriers to protect the team from the acid splatter. Katie aimed carefully and fired single shots instead of full automatic bursts. Her first shot took down a creature that was trying to flank them from the left. Her second shot caught one in mid-leap as it tried to drop on Zixthera from above. "Good shooting, human," Gorth called out as he smashed another creature with his hammer. The attack was over as quickly as it had begun. The surviving creatures melted back into the darkness, their howls fading into the distance. "Why did they retreat?" Melindra asked, looking around nervously. Katie checked her scanner. The movement signatures were still there, scattered throughout the forest around them, but they were keeping their distance now. "We fought back harder than they expected," she said. "They will follow us and wait for a better opportunity." "How do you know so much about predator behavior?" Zixthera asked. Katie shouldered her rifle and started walking toward the crashed ship signal. "Because my species used to be prey. We learned to think like predators to survive." The others followed her, their earlier mockery replaced by thoughtful silence. For the first time since the simulation began, they were starting to realize that the small human might know more about survival than they had assumed. Behind them, in the darkness between the twisted trees, 8-legged shapes moved silently through the shadows, following and waiting for their next chance to strike. The crashed survey ship lay twisted between 3 massive trees like a broken toy. Its hull had been split open by the impact, revealing dark corridors filled with alien vegetation that had grown through the breach. Glowing fungi covered most of the exterior, giving the wreckage an eerie green light that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. Katie crouched behind a fallen log and studied the wreck through her scanner. The data core signal was definitely coming from inside, but her scanner also showed movement throughout the ship. Something had made the crashed vessel its home. "Looks empty to me," Gorth rumbled, hefting his warhammer. "We go in, grab the data core, and get out." "Wait," Katie said quietly. "Look at the entry points." Zixthera extended her antennae and focused on the ship. Now she could see what Katie had noticed. The holes in the hull were not just from the crash. Something had been digging new tunnels through the metal, creating a network of passages that connected to the original breach. "Something lives in there," Melindra whispered, her crystalline skin flickering with nervous energy. Katie pointed to the ground around the ship. "Look at the cleared areas. See how the vegetation has been stripped away in perfect circles? Those are feeding zones. Whatever is in there comes out to hunt. The pattern was clear once Katie pointed it out. The fungi and thorny plants that covered everything else on Kithara 7 had been completely removed from several circular areas around the ship. The ground in those circles was smooth and bare, stained with dark patches that could only be old blood. How many? Zixthera asked. Katie studied the feeding zones and the tunnel entrances. At least 3, maybe more. They are big based on the size of those tunnels, Gorth snorted. 3 creatures against 4 armed soldiers. I like those odds. You should not, Katie replied. They chose this ship as their nest for a reason. It gives them advantages we do not have. As if to prove her point, a sound echoed from inside the wreck. It was a low grinding noise like metal being scraped against stone. Something large was moving through the corridors inside. We need that data core, Zixthera said. The mission depends on it. Katie nodded and checked her scanner again. The signal was coming from what had been the ship's bridge, located in the forward section that was buried deepest in the twisted trees. Getting there would require going through most of the ship. There is another way, she said after studying the scanner readings. The ventilation system, it runs parallel to the main corridors, but the passages are smaller. Too small for us, Gorth pointed out. His massive frame would never fit through standard ventilation ducts. Too small for you, Katie corrected. I can fit. I can reach the bridge through the vents while you 3 create a distraction at the main entrance. Zixthera's compound eyes studied Katie with something that might have been respect. That is actually a good plan, but what if you get trapped in there? Then you complete the mission without me, Katie said simply. The plan was risky, but it was their best option. Zixthera, Melindra, and Gorth would approach the main breach in the hull and make enough noise to draw the creatures toward them. While the nest defenders were focused on the obvious threat, Katie would slip around to the rear of the ship and find an access point to the ventilation system. Katie worked her way around the wreck, staying low and moving carefully through the shadows. The rear section of the ship had taken less damage in the crash, and she found an intact maintenance hatch that led to the engineering section. Her scanner showed no movement in that part of the ship. The hatch opened with a soft hiss, revealing a corridor filled with floating spores and trailing vines. Katie pulled a cloth over her nose and mouth to filter out the worst of the contamination and stepped inside. The ship's interior was a maze of twisted metal and alien plant growth. Emergency. Lighting still functioned in some sections, casting red shadows that made everything look like it was covered in blood. Katie moved through the corridors as quietly as possible, following her scanner toward the ventilation access point. Behind her, she could hear the sound of her teammates beginning their distraction. Plasma fire lit up the main breach, followed by the roar of angry creatures and the crash of Gorth's warhammer against metal. Katie found the ventilation access panel and pried it open with her knife. The duct beyond was dark and narrow, barely wide enough for her shoulders. She squeezed inside and began crawling toward the bridge. The ventilation system was in better condition than the main corridors, but it was not pleasant. Her hands and knees quickly became covered in a layer of slime that had built up over the months since the crash. Strange smells filled the narrow space, and more than once she had to crawl over the dried remains of small creatures that had died in the ducts. The sounds of fighting grew louder as she approached the forward section of the ship. Through grates in the ductwork, she could see flashes of plasma fire and the shadows of large creatures moving through the corridors below. Her teammates were doing their job, keeping the nest defenders busy. Katie reached a junction where several ducts came together. Her scanner showed the bridge was directly below her, but there was a problem. The duct that led down to the bridge was partially collapsed, blocked by a tangle of metal and vine growth. She could hear something moving in the bridge below. One of the creatures had not gone to investigate the distraction. It was still guarding the data core. Katie pulled out her knife and began carefully cutting through the vines that blocked the duct. The plant material was tough and fibrous, and cutting it made soft sounds that seemed loud in the confined space. She paused frequently to listen, making sure the creature below had not noticed her presence. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, She had cleared enough of the blockage to squeeze through. The duct angled downward toward a grate that opened into what had been the ship's bridge. Through the grate, Katie could see the data core sitting in its protective housing near the captain's chair. The bridge was dark except for the glow from the core's status lights. Everything seemed quiet and peaceful. Too quiet. Katie's instincts, honed by millions of years of human evolution, screamed that something was wrong. She lay still in the duct and watched the bridge carefully. Her scanner showed one large movement signature somewhere in the room, but she could not see where. Then she noticed the shadows. They were wrong. One of the shadows near the far wall was too deep, too dark. As she watched, the shadow moved slightly. The creature was there, perfectly camouflaged against the twisted metal of the wrecked bridge. It was waiting, probably aware that someone was trying to reach the data core. Katie could make out its general shape now that she knew where to look. It was roughly humanoid, but much larger, with long arms that ended in claws and a head that was too large for its body. The sounds of fighting from the main part of the ship were getting louder. Her teammates needed her to complete the mission quickly, but the creature between her and the data core was not going to make it easy. Katie studied the layout of the bridge and formed a plan. It was not a good plan, but it was the only option she had. She would have to move fast and hope that her small size and human reflexes were enough to keep her alive. She carefully removed the grate and dropped silently into the bridge. The creature's head turned toward her immediately, and she found herself staring into eyes that glowed with their own pale light. The thing's mouth opened, revealing rows of sharp teeth. Instead of running toward the data core, Katie did something unexpected. She ran directly at the creature, firing her plasma rifle as she charged. The creature, surprised by this aggressive move from such a small opponent, reared back and swiped at her with its claws. Katie slid under the swipe and rolled, past the creature, coming up near the data core housing. Her shots had not seriously hurt the thing, but they had confused it long enough for her to reach her objective. The creature spun around with surprising speed, but Katie was already disconnecting the data core from its housing. The small device came free just as the creature's claws slashed through the air where her head had been a moment before. Katie dove through the nearest exit, clutching the data core against her chest. Behind her, the creature roared in anger and gave chase, its claws scraping against the metal walls as it pursued her through the wrecked corridors. She ran toward the sounds of fighting, where her teammates were still battling the other nest, defenders. The mission was almost complete, but the hardest part was still ahead. They had to get out of the ship alive, and now every creature in the nest knew exactly where they were. Katie burst out of the ship's twisted corridors with the data core clutched in her arms and a massive creature close behind her. The thing that had been guarding the bridge was even larger than she had realized. In the dim light outside the wreck, she could see it clearly for the first time. It stood nearly 12 feet tall with arms that reached almost to the ground and claws that could tear through metal like paper. "Got it!" she shouted to her teammates as she ran toward them. Zixthera, Melindra, and Gorth were fighting 3 other creatures near the main breach in the ship's hull. The battle was not going well. Gorth had deep claw marks across his fur, and green acid blood had burned holes in Zixthera's armor. Melindra was struggling to maintain energy barriers that kept flickering and failing. "Time to go," Zixthera called out as she saw Katie approaching with the 4th creature in pursuit. The team began a fighting retreat toward the extraction point, but the creatures followed them. These were not like the pack hunters they had faced earlier. These were bigger, stronger, and much more aggressive. They had been disturbed in their nest and they wanted revenge. Katie checked her scanner as they ran through the twisted forest. The extraction point was still over a kilometer away, and the creatures were keeping pace with them easily. Worse, her scanner was picking up more movement signatures converging on their position from all directions. "They are calling for help," she shouted over the sound of plasma fire and roaring creatures. "What do you mean?" Melindra asked as she created another energy barrier to block a swipe from massive claws. "Pack behavior," Katie explained between shots from her rifle. "The nest was attacked, so they are calling every predator in the area to help drive us off." As if to prove her point, howls and roars began echoing through the forest from multiple directions. The sounds were getting closer, and there were many of them. "We need to move faster," Gorth said, but his injuries were slowing him down. Katie looked at her scanner again and made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. This way, she said, turning away from the direct path to the extraction point. That is the wrong direction, Zixthera protested. Trust me, Katie replied, and kept running toward what her scanner showed as rougher terrain. The others followed her, mainly because they had no better options. Behind them, the creatures from the nest continued their pursuit, and the sounds of other predators grew closer from all sides. Katie led them up a rocky slope covered with the same twisted trees and glowing fungi as the rest of the forest. The ground became more uneven, forcing everyone to slow down, but it also forced their pursuers to slow down as well. Where are you taking us? Melindra demanded as she stumbled over a root. Higher ground, Katie said. Predators think differently when they have to chase prey uphill. She was right. The creatures following them became more cautious as the terrain grew more difficult. They could no longer charge straight at the team, and they had to watch their footing on the loose rocks and tangled roots. Katie found what she was looking for near the top of the rocky hill. A narrow canyon cut through the stone, creating a natural choke point that was only wide enough for one creature at a time. Better, yet, there was a way around the canyon that would let them continue toward the extraction point. Through here, she called to the others. It is a dead end, Zixthera said, looking at the narrow passage between the stone walls. No, it opens up on the other side. I can see it on the scanner. They squeezed through the canyon single file, with Katie in the lead and Gorth bringing up the rear. The passage was so narrow that the massive bracken had to turn sideways to fit through some sections. The creatures pursuing them reached the canyon entrance just as Gorth disappeared into the narrow passage. The largest one tried to follow, but its broad shoulders would not fit through the opening. It roared in frustration and began clawing at the stone walls, trying to widen the passage. That will not hold them for long, Katie said as they emerged from the other end of the canyon. But it will buy us time. They were now on the far side of the rocky hill, with a clear path down toward the extraction point. Katie's scanner showed they were less than half a kilometer away from safety, but something was wrong. Her scanner was also showing a massive movement signature approaching the extraction point from another direction, something much larger than the creatures they had been fighting. Commander Thexval said the apex predator would not be released for 6 hours, Melindra said, checking her chronometer. We still have 2 hours left. Katie studied her scanner readings more carefully. The large signature was not coming from the direction of the simulation controllers. It was moving through the forest on its own, drawn by the sounds of fighting and the scent of blood. I do not think it was released, she said quietly. I think we woke it up. A sound echoed through the forest that made everyone freeze in terror. It was not like the roars and howls they had been hearing from the other creatures. This was something deeper, more primal. It spoke to instincts buried so deep in their evolutionary memory that even the battle-hardened alien warriors felt their knees go weak. The sound came again, closer this time. Trees began falling in the distance, crashing to the ground with tremendous noise. Whatever was making that sound was big enough to knock down the massive twisted trees like they were saplings. We need to reach the extraction point now, Zixthera said, but her voice was shaky. They began running down the hillside, abandoning any attempt at stealth. Speed was more important than silence now. Behind them, they could hear the creatures from the nest still trying to break through the rocky canyon. Ahead of them, the sounds of falling trees grew louder. Katie's scanner showed the apex predator was moving faster than seemed possible for something so large. It was going to reach the extraction point before they did. Change of plans, she called to the others. We cannot outrun it to the extraction point. Then what do we do? Gorth asked. Katie looked at her scanner one more time, studying the movement patterns of all the creatures in the area. The apex predator was heading straight for the extraction point, probably drawn by the energy signature of the evacuation beacon. The creatures from the nest were still behind them, finally breaking through the canyon. And scattered throughout the forest were dozens of smaller predators, all converging on the area where the team was trying to escape. We let them fight each other, she said. What do you mean? Melindra asked. Katie pointed toward a clearing visible through the trees, ahead of them. The apex predator is territorial. It will not want all these other creatures in its hunting ground if we can get them all in the same place at the same time. They will fight each other instead of hunting us, Zixthara finished, understanding, dawning in her compound eyes. It was a desperate plan, but it was better than being caught between multiple groups of predators with nowhere to run. Katie led them toward the clearing, making sure to leave a clear trail that the creatures from the nest could follow. They reached the edge of the clearing, just as the apex predator burst through the trees on the opposite side. Katie got her first, clear look at the thing that had made even Commander Thexval speak of it with respect. It was huge, even bigger than she had expected. The creature stood at least 15 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be made of muscle and bone and sharp edges. Its skin was dark and armored, covered with spikes and ridges that would make it nearly impossible to hurt with conventional weapons. 6 limbs ended in claws that could probably cut through the hull of a spaceship. But it was the eyes that made Katie's blood run cold. The apex predator had intelligence behind those eyes. This was not just a big, dangerous animal. This was a thinking creature that knew how to hunt, how to plan, and how to kill. The apex predator saw them at the edge of the clearing and began moving in their direction. But before it could reach them, the creatures from the nest burst into the clearing from another direction, still pursuing the team. The apex predator stopped and turned toward the newcomers. A sound rumbled from deep in its chest, a warning that could be felt in the bones of everyone present. The nest creatures hesitated, suddenly aware that they had entered the territory of something much more dangerous than the small beings they had been chasing. Katie and her teammates backed slowly toward the trees, trying to stay out of the fight that was about to begin. All around the clearing, other predators were emerging from the forest, drawn by the sounds and smells of potential prey. The apex predator looked around at all the intruders in its domain, and its eyes began to glow with anger. This was its territory, and it was not going to share. What happened next would determine whether Katie and her team lived to see the extraction point or became food for the deadliest creature on Cathera 7. The clearing erupted into chaos as the apex predator charged toward the nest creatures that had dared to enter its territory. The massive beast moved with shocking speed for something so large, its 6 limbs carrying it across the open ground, like a living avalanche. The first nest creature tried to stand its ground, raising its claws to meet the attack. The apex predator hit it like a freight train, sending the 12-foot-tall defender flying across the clearing to crash into a tree with a sickening crunch. The tree, thick as a man's waist, snapped in half from the impact. Katie and her teammates pressed themselves against the trees at the edge of the clearing, trying to stay invisible while the territorial battle raged in front of them. More predators were emerging from the forest, drawn by the sounds of fighting. Some were creatures they had seen before, but others were new and equally terrifying. A pack of the 8-legged acid spitters rushed into the clearing, their glowing, saliva already dripping from their needle teeth. They tried to surround the apex predator, but the massive creature spun around faster than anything that size should be able to move. Its tail, which Katie had not noticed before, swept 3 of the pack hunters into the air. They landed hard and did not get up. "It is playing with them," Zixthara whispered, her compound eyes fixed on the battle. Katie watched the apex predator fight and realized Zixthara was right. The creature was not trying to kill its opponents as quickly as possible. It was demonstrating its dominance, showing every predator in the area that this was its territory, and they were only here because it allowed them to be. But the demonstration was working too well. Instead of driving the other predators away, the display of power was attracting more of them. Creatures that normally would never work together were being drawn into the clearing by the scent of blood and the promise of a massive meal if they could somehow bring down the apex predator. "We need to move," Katie said quietly. While they are all distracted, she began edging around the clearing, staying close to the tree line where the shadows were deepest. The others followed her, moving as quietly as they could manage. The extraction point was less than 300 meters away now, but they would have to cross open ground to reach it. A new sound made everyone freeze. It was a low humming noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Katie looked up and saw something that made her heart sink. Flying creatures were circling overhead, attracted by the battle below. They looked like giant bats with too many wings and mouths full of teeth that glowed in the darkness. One of the flying creatures dove toward the apex predator, trying to strike at its back while it was fighting the ground-based predators. The massive beast caught the flyer in mid-dive, crushing it with one clawed hand before throwing the broken body at another group of attackers. "The extraction point," Melindra said, pointing toward a clearing visible through the trees ahead of them. Katie could see the evacuation beacon, a tall metal pole with a blinking light at the top. The extraction zone was a circle of clear ground around the beacon, kept free of vegetation by the energy field that would bring the rescue shuttle down. But there was a problem. Two of the nest creatures had broken away from the main battle and were heading toward the extraction point. They had either lost interest in fighting the apex predator or decided that the strange energy signature from the beacon was more interesting. "They will reach the extraction point before we do," Gorth said. Katie studied the situation. The two creatures were larger and faster than the team, and they had a head start. In a straight race, there was no way the 4 recruits could beat them to the beacon. "Not if we do not race them," she said. Before anyone could ask what she meant, Katie stepped out of the shadows and into the open area between the trees and the extraction point. She raised her plasma rifle and fired a single shot into the air. The bright flash and loud crack of the plasma bolt got the attention of every predator in the area, including the apex predator. For a moment, the entire clearing fell silent as dozens of deadly creatures turned to look at the small human standing alone in the open. "Katie, what are you doing?" Zixthera hissed from the tree line. Katie ignored her teammates and started walking toward the apex predator. The massive creature was standing over the broken bodies of several smaller predators, its armored hide unmarked despite the fierce battle. Its glowing eyes focused on Katie as she approached, and a low rumble came from deep in its chest. "You know what you are," Katie said in a clear, calm voice. She was still walking forward, her rifle lowered but ready. "You are big. You are fast. You are strong. You are probably the deadliest thing on this entire world." The apex predator tilted its massive head, studying this strange small creature that was walking toward it instead of running away. The other predators in the clearing had also stopped moving, confused by this unexpected behavior. "But you know what I am too, do not you?" Katie continued, never breaking eye contact with the creature. "My species did not evolve with claws or fangs or armor plating. We did not develop energy manipulation or natural weapons. Do you know why?" She was close enough now to see her own reflection in the creature's glowing eyes. The apex predator had not moved, but every muscle in its body was tensed, ready to strike. "Because we did not need them. We hunted creatures like you with pointed sticks and determination. We chased mammoths across continents until they died of exhaustion. We stared down cave bears and made them back down first." Katie stopped walking when she was less than 10 feet from the massive predator. Around the clearing, every other creature was completely still, watching this impossible confrontation between the smallest and largest predators present. "You are an apex predator," Katie said quietly. "But I am from a species of apex predators. The difference is my kind learned to hunt everything else that thought it was apex too." The clearing was silent except for the distant sounds of the alien forest. Katie and the apex predator stared at each other, predator recognizing predator across the vast gulf of evolution and species. Then slowly, the massive creature took a step backward. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but every predator in the clearing saw it. The apex predator had yielded ground to the small human. It had acknowledged in the ancient language that all predators understand that this tiny creature was dangerous in ways that size and strength could not measure. Katie nodded once, a gesture of respect between equals, then turned and walked calmly toward the extraction point. Behind her, the apex predator watched her go, making no move to follow. The other predators in the clearing began to disperse, melting back into the forest as quickly as they had appeared. The territorial display was over, and they had learned something important about the small creatures they had been hunting. Katie's teammates rushed out of the trees to join her at the extraction beacon. Zixthera, Melindra, and Gorth all looked at her with expressions of amazement and something that might have been fear. How did you know it would back down? Melindra asked. Katie secured the data core in her equipment pack and checked her chronometer. The extraction shuttle would arrive in 20 minutes. I did not know, she said simply. But predators respect other predators. It was a calculated risk. What if you had been wrong? Gorth asked. Katie looked back toward the forest where the apex predator had disappeared into the shadows between the twisted trees. Then you would have completed the mission without me, just like I said. The extraction shuttle arrived exactly, on schedule, its powerful engine scattering the glowing fungi as it settled onto the beacon platform. As the team climbed aboard, Katie took one last look at the deadly world of Cathera 7. Somewhere in that forest, the apex predator was probably watching them leave. She wondered if it understood what had really happened in that clearing. Two predators had met, and both had walked away. In the violent world of Cathera 7, that was as close to a peaceful resolution as anyone could hope for. When Commander Thexval reviewed the mission recordings later, he made a note in Katie Barnes's file that would follow her for the rest of her military career. Recommendation for immediate promotion to Advanced Tactical Command. Note: this recruit possesses an understanding of predator psychology that may prove invaluable in future operations. But Katie never saw that note. She was too busy planning her next mission, where she would once again prove that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that does not look dangerous at all.